Listen to part of a lecture in a botany class.
So, continuing with crop domestication and corn, or maize as it's often called. Obviously, it's one of the world's most important crops today. It's such a big part of the diet in so many countries, and it's got so many different uses that it's hard to imagine a world without it. But because it doesn't grow naturally without human cultivation, and because there's no obvious wild relative of maize, for the longest time, researchers weren't able to find any clear link between maize and other living plants. And that's made it hard for them to trace the history of maize. Now, scientific theories about the origins of maize first started coming out in the 1930s. One involved a plant called teosinte. Teosinte is a tall grass that grows wild in certain parts of Mexico and Guatemala. When researchers first started looking at wild teosinte plants, they thought there was a chance that the two plants, maize and teosinte, were related. The young wild teosinte plant looks a lot like the corn plant, and the plants continue to resemble each other, at least superficially, even when they're developed. But when the scientists examined the fruits of the two plants, it was a different story. When you look at ripe corn, you see row upon row of juicy kernels, all those tiny little yellow squares that people eat. Fully grown teosinte, on the other hand, has a skinny stalk that holds only a dozen or so kernels behind a hard, almost stone-like casing. In fact, based on the appearance of its fruit, teosinte was initially considered to be a closer relative to rice than to maize. But there was one geneticist named George Beadle who didn't give up so easily on the idea that teosinte might be, the parent of corn. While still a student in the 1930s, Beadle actually found that the two plants had very similar chromosomes, very similar genetic information. In fact, he was even able to make fertile hybrids between the two plants. In hybridization, you remember, the genes of two species of plants are mixed to produce a new third plant, a hybrid. And if this offspring, this hybrid, is fertile, then that suggests that the two species are closely related genetically. This new hybrid plant looked like an intermediate right between maize and teosinte. So Beadle concluded that maize must have been developed over many years, that it is a domesticated form of teosinte. Many experts in the scientific community, however, remained unconvinced by his conclusions. They believed that with so many apparent differences between the two plants, it would have been unlikely that prehistoric peoples could have domesticated maize from teosinte. I mean, when you think about it, these people lived in small groups, and they had to be on the move constantly as the seasons changed. So for them to selectively breed, to have the patience to be able to pick out just the right plants, and gradually, over generations, separate out the durable, nutritious maize plant from the brittle teosinte that easily broke apart, it's a pretty impressive feat, and you can easily see why so many experts would have been skeptical. But as it turns out, Beadle found even more evidence for his theory when he continued his experiments, producing new hybrids to investigate the genetic relationship between teosinte and maize. Through these successive experiments, he calculated that only about 5 specific genes were responsible for the main differences between teosinte and maize. The plants were otherwise surprisingly similar genetically. And more recently, botanists have used modern DNA testing to scan plant samples collected from throughout the Western Hemisphere. This has allowed them to pinpoint where the domestication of maize most likely took place, and their research took them to a particular river valley in southern Mexico. They've also been able to estimate that the domestication of maize most likely occurred about 9,000 years ago, and subsequent archaeological digs have confirmed this estimate. In one site, archaeologists uncovered a set of tools that were nearly 9,000 years old, and these tools were covered with a dusty residue, a residue of maize, as it turns out, thus making them the oldest physical evidence of maize that we've found so far.
What is the lecture mainly about? Listen to part of a lecture in a botany class.
It's autumn, and as you know, in most parts of the United States, the leaves on the trees are changing color from green to yellow, orange, and lots of other colors. So this will be a great time to talk about how and why some of these leaves turn one color in particular, and that's bright red. Well, before we discuss why leaves turn red, first let's, look, I know this is very old material, but just to play it safe, let's first go over why leaves are usually green. It's chlorophyll, right? Leaves get their green color from chlorophyll, the chemical that's responsible for photosynthesis. The chlorophyll in the leaves collects energy from the sun in the form of sunlight, and it converts this energy into sugar, which is food for the plant. It's chlorophyll that makes leaves green most of the time. Now, the classic explanation for why leaves change color is this. In autumn, the leaves start preparing for the winter and stop synthesizing new chlorophyll. Since chlorophyll is sensitive to sunlight and to cold temperatures, both of which you get in autumn, the existing chlorophyll in the leaves breaks down. And since it's not being replaced by the new chlorophyll, the green color of the leaves gradually fades away. As this happens, the other pigments present in the leaf become visible. According to the classic theory, this is true for the red pigment as well. It was there in the leaf all along, but it was hidden by the green chlorophyll. Okay, so that's the classic explanation, and it's partially right. Why do I say partially? Well, it's probably true for pigments like yellow or orange, but it doesn't seem to hold for the red pigment. Let's back up a bit. Just what produces this red color in leaves? It's a red pigment called anthocyanin. Here's where the classic explanation doesn't seem to apply to red. What's interesting is that during the summer there was very little, if any, anthocyanin in the leaves, but in the weeks before a tree is about to drop its leaves, the production of anthocyanins increases significantly. In other words, unlike those other pigments, anthocyanins are not just unmasked by the breakdown of chlorophyll in autumn, they're actually created at this time. So that raises a question. Why would a tree produce more anthocyanin just before dropping its leaves? Why does the tree spend so much of its resources doing this just before the leaves fall off? On the surface, this doesn't make sense. It'd be like spending money to, to have your old car repainted when you know the car's not going to last more than a couple of months. All this extra anthocyanin in the autumn seems like a waste, but remember, nature is very economical with its resources. So that means anthocyanin must be serving some function that's important for the tree. Today, there are some theories about what that function might be. One of them involves predatory insects. Another involves fungi. You know, the more I read about these theories and the related research, it always created more questions for me than answers. So I was really glad to learn about a totally different theory, a new one. It seemed to come with research and data that give a full explanation. So here it is. Remember I said the chlorophyll breaks down? Well, in autumn, a whole lot of other chemical constituents of the leaf break down as well. I don't mean they're totally destroyed, because actually they break down into other, different chemicals that the tree can reabsorb from the leaves and reuse later. Now, this reabsorption process is very important for the tree, and here's the key. It's sensitive to light, meaning that too much exposure to sunlight can interfere with this process. So where does anthocyanin fit in here? Well, anthocyanin's more stable than chlorophyll. It's not harmed as easily by the sun or the cold. So it's still working long after the chlorophyll breaks down. But what does it do? The theory is that anthocyanin protects the reabsorption process from the sunlight. For example, if you look closely at a red leaf on a tree, you'll notice that most of the red pigment is on the upper side of the leaf, the side facing the sun. This new theory suggests that what the anthocyanin is doing there on top is shielding the rest of the leaf from the sunlight. And more importantly, allowing those important chemicals to be reabsorbed by the tree.
What is the main purpose of the lecture?
Many organisms have developed the ability to survive in harsh environmental conditions, extreme heat or cold, or very dry conditions, like plants in the desert. Your textbook doesn't have much about the specifics on desert plants, but I think that desert plants are great examples of specialized adaptations to extreme environmental conditions. So, with desert plants, there are basically 3 different adaptive strategies. And I should point out that these strategies are not specific to any particular species. Many different species have developed each of the adaptations. So, first off, there are succulent plants. There are many different species of succulent plants, but they all can absorb and store a lot of water. Obviously, opportunities to get water in the desert are few and far between. Generally, rains are light and short, so the rain doesn't seep too far down into the soil, and there's a limited window of time for any plant to get the water before it evaporates. But succulent plants have a spread out and shallow root system that can quickly pull in water from the top inch of soil, though the soil has to be saturated, since succulents aren't good at absorbing water from soil that's only a little moist. Succulent plants also are well suited to retaining water, important in an environment where rainy days are rare. Succulent plants can store water in their leaves, in their stems, or in their roots, and to keep that moisture from evaporating in the hot desert sun, most succulent plants have a waxy outer layer that makes them almost waterproof when their stomates are closed. They also preserve water by minimizing their surface area. The more of the plant that's out in the sun, the more potential there is to lose stored up water. And that means that most succulent plants have few, if any, leaves. Now, besides succulent plants, there are also drought-tolerant plants. Drought-tolerant plants are like bears in a way. You know how bears mostly sleep through the winter? They can survive without eating because their metabolism slows down. Well, drought-tolerant plants also go into a dormant state when resources, in their case water, run short. A drought-tolerant plant can actually dry out without dying. I said before that most desert rains are light and brief, but occasionally there's a heavy one. Drought-tolerant plants revive after one of these significant rainfalls, and they're able to absorb a good bit of the rainfall due to their deep roots. Actually, the root system for drought-tolerant plants is more extensive than the root systems of many plants that live in wetter climates. Drought-tolerant plants can even absorb water from relatively dry soil because of their deep roots, in contrast to succulent plants. The third adaptive strategy is to avoid the drought conditions altogether. Yes, there are plants that do this. Annual plants. An annual plant will mature and produce seeds in a single season that will become the next generation of annual plants. In desert conditions, annual plants grow in the fall or spring to avoid the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Of course, these plants could face a serious problem if a particular fall or spring happened to be very dry. They would have difficulty growing and could die before producing seeds. But they have a mechanism to prevent 1 year of low rainfall from wiping them out. Not all seeds an annual plant puts out will grow the following year. Some seeds remain dormant in the ground for several years. It's a type of insurance that protects the annual plants from a season of poor growing conditions, of unfavorable weather.
What is the lecture mainly about?